Hi, everybody. Right, I think we can start. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce to you tonight's speaker, Dr. Alfred Hiatt from Queen Mary, University of London. Alfred completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge with the focus on forged documents. And this research was the basis of his book, The Making of Medieval Forgeries, which was published in 2004. Now, previous to joining Queen Mary, Alfred was also a junior research fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, and a lecturer at the University of Leeds. And although he's published extensively, and I'm not going to mention lots of different things, I thought with today's lecture, it would be good to mention his book on medieval maps called Cartography Between Christian Europe and the Arabic Islamic World, 1100 to 1500, which was published by Brill in 2021. And tonight, he will be speaking to us about the Antonine Itinerary and the invention of Roman Britain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. And it's a great honor to be here and to be able to address this audience. I am conscious that this topic may be a little bit away from many people's interests tonight, so I hope nevertheless it will have something to entertain you or at least inform you. The Antonine Itinerary has long been recognized as an important witness to the Roman world of the late Empire. Even if today discussion of it is restricted to a small group of specialists, it remains an important reference point for classical studies. Look up a place in the ancient world, and there is a good chance you will find mention of its appearance in the Antonine Itinerary, alongside sources such as the geographies of Ptolemy or Strabo, Pliny the Elder's natural history, or the Roman map known as the Poitinger table. Yet a history of the reception of the Antonine Itinerary, which spans the period from the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages to the present, has never been written. My paper today is an attempt to sketch out the grounds of a reception history up to the 18th century, with a focus on the text reception in England. I will argue that, along with other texts, the itinerary contributed to the construction of Roman Britain as a spatially defined entity, one that could be known in detail, understood in terms of a network of routes, and read as part of a history of settlement extending from antiquity to modernity. What, to begin with, is the Antonine Itinerary? In the first place, a misnomer. It is not one itinerary, but many. It cannot with certainty be associated with any one of the Antonine emperors. It certainly does not represent the journeys of any one individual. As we have the text, it is a series of lists of place names and numbers denoting the mileages between them. For each itinerary, a total mileage is given from its starting point to its end point, which in theory should be the sum of all the intermediate stages. In practice, the inevitable errors in copying Roman numerals and conceivably errors in the original text mean that the headline figure of an itinerary does not always agree with its component parts. This is an example from the British itineraries, which is going to be the main focus of this talk, and this is the sixth of 15 itineraries from Roman Britain. This is an itinerary so what we see is an itinerary from London to Lincoln, and you can see the stages set out there with the mileage between each stage, and with a headline figure at the top of the total mileage. This is regarded by people who've studied the British itineraries very intensely as probably the only one of the 15 itineraries where everything is perfect. All the numbers add up, and where you can actually locate all the places plausibly, indeed convincingly. You can see the letters MP, which are used, refer to mille passum, so that is to say a mile, miles. And in the manuscripts, if you look at the same itinerary in a medieval manuscript, this is a 15th century manuscript, ultimately deriving from a 10th century manuscript of the itinerary, and you can see that same itinerary from London to Lincoln. You can see how it's set out, and this is typical for the way that the itineraries appear in manuscripts. But you can see that MP has been expanded to MPM, a mistake that crept in very early in the transmission of the itineraries, and it's glossed by the scribes as milia plus minus, so like miles more or less. Taken as a whole, the 256 itineraries that make up the Antonine Itinerary cover most of the Roman Empire, albeit with some notable gaps. The sequence begins in North Africa, moves to Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily, then Italy. A monumental multi-stage itinerary leads from Rome through North Italy, then Thrace, Syria, finally along the Nile, finishing in Upper Egypt. From there, the sequence moves to Cappadocia, then Pannonia, back to Italy, and finally across to the western provinces of Gaul, Hispania, and Britain. To these land itineraries, a set of maritime itineraries appears to have been added at an early date of transmission. Numerous theories have been advanced to explain how this text, or compilation of texts, came about. Is the Antonine Itinerary an official production of the Roman imperial bureaucracy? Is it a list of military ways or military supply stations? Is it a representation of the cursus publicus, effectively the postal routes? Does it have any association with a particular emperor, be it Antoninus Pius or some other Antonine emperor? Or is it what one historian has described as the work of a dog's body, another a hobbyist's assemblage? The date of the work is certainly late antique, but precision here is again difficult. As antiquarians from the 16th century onward noted, it contains some recognizably 4th century names, such as Diocletianopolis in Macedonia, to give just one example, but its basis may well be a century or two earlier. I'm less concerned with the actual origins of the Antonine Itinerary tonight, and more with, firstly, the medieval reception of it, which I'll say a little bit about, and then, because I'm focusing on the British itineraries, its reception from the 16th through to the 18th centuries. The earliest surviving copy of the itinerary is contained in a late 7th century Spanish manuscript that found its way to Oviedo by 920 Christian era, and which became part of the collection now in the Escorial. We know that the itinerary was being copied in Francia around the same time. Certainly by the 9th and 10th centuries, copies seem to have been circulating reasonably widely within Carolingian scriptoria, places like Colmar, Reims, Freising, Speyer, and St. Peter's at Ghent. Around this time, an important event occurred in the itinerary's textual history. It was conjoined with another text, a cosmography originally attributed to the 4th or 5th century rhetorician Julius Honorius, which purported to be the results of a survey of the known world commissioned by Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and carried out by 4 surveyors. A redaction of this cosmography which incorporated the description of the world in Paulus Orosius's Historiae, had appeared by the 8th century. To this version of the cosmography, no longer attributed to Julius Honorius but to Ethicus Ister, the Antonine Itinerary was appended. This conjunction of the two texts became standard in medieval manuscripts. As a result, the Antonine Itinerary seemed to many medieval readers to be read as a continuation of the description of the world apparently recorded by the surveyors sent out from Rome. Indeed, those medieval manuscripts that carry a title call the text not the Itinerarium Antonini, but the Itinerarium Antonii, so Antony's itinerary, which some readers took to be Mark Antony's itinerary. And you can maybe see this, my point, in this manuscript, 12th century manuscript, where you have the cosmography. This cosmography by now attributed to Ethicus. But we're ending with this statement about the return of the surveyors to the Senate. But then immediately following, we have the Antonine Itinerary. So there is a sense in which the itinerary is not being regarded as an independent text throughout its medieval history. Numbers of extant medieval manuscripts show healthy levels of copying of the itinerary in the Carolingian era and in the 15th century, but relatively little in between. It is indeed hard to find much evidence for the use of the itinerary during the Middle Ages, other than occasional consultation by local historians keen to verify the ancient name of their city. The spike in numbers in the 15th century can be explained by humanist interest in a 10th century manuscript from the Cathedral Library at Speyer. This manuscript, you can see the remarkable kind of frontispiece to it. It was copied at the Council of Basel. This is a copy now in the Bodleian, which was made there at Basel in 1436. So the manuscript seems to have been taken from Speyer to Basel and copied there, and you can see it's kind of neo-imperialist iconography there. The manuscript presented the itinerary as one of its first items immediately in its now typical position following this cosmography of Pseudo-Ethicus, but also with descriptions of Rome and Constantinople, as well as the remarkable compendium of late imperial provincial administration, coming right at the end, the Notitia Dignitatum. By the start of the 16th century, the Antonine Itinerary was just beginning to attract serious scholarly attention, along with other sources of Roman imperial geography, such as Claudius Ptolemy's geography, the 2nd century CE, mathematical geography with maps and identification of places and peoples using coordinates of longitude and latitude, Strabo's 1st century descriptive geography, which had, along with Ptolemy, been translated into Latin in the 15th century, as well as also well-known to the Middle Ages sources such as Pliny's Natural History and Pomponius Mela's De Chorographia. A print edition of the itinerary would appear in Paris in 1512, rapidly followed by an inferior Aldine edition with improved editions in 1575 and 1600. By the time of the latter, the itinerary was both a reasonably well-known and well-studied text. Furthermore, thanks to the re-emergence of the Peutinger table, the itinerary could be compared with its closest analogue. So the Poitinger table is a Roman itinerary map which was copied in the early 13th century, ultimately from a late antique original. As you can maybe see, the map is structured in terms of itineraries, in terms of places and different stations, but with mileages given in between the various stations. What we're looking at here is the western end of the Poitinger table, which would originally have been a scroll, which was then at a later point cut up into parchment segments. And the western end is incomplete. So this stub is all that's left of Britain. You have then Gaul extending along here, Spain along here, and North Africa along there. So what the important point for European antiquaries was that the Poitinger table, which came into the possession of Conrad Poitinger in the early 16th century, was then lost for just under 100 years, resurfaced in the 1590s, and could then be compared in detail with the Antonine Itinerary. Of course, the absence of the British section, which originally would have been there, but obviously being a scroll, probably this was the outermost portion of the map and was lost. In fact, the absence of a very substantial segment of the Poitinger table for the British antiquarians meant that they actually had to rely more on the Antonine Itinerary, as well as other sources like Ptolemy's geography. The Antonine Itinerary reached Britain by the 12th century at the latest. A 12th century copy from Christchurch, Canterbury, remained extant until the 19th century. There is a 14th century copy of the Maritime Itinerary, which survives in a manuscript with connections to York. Undoubtedly, some medieval copies of the itinerary have been lost. In the 16th century, John Leland recorded 3 copies of the itinerary at Battle Abbey, Ramsey, and Ely, all now lost. All the same, evidence of the use of the itinerary in Britain is limited. It has been suggested that it was one of the sources of the Hereford Mappamundi from around 1300, and some support for this view comes from the scene depicted in the map's lower left corner, which shows Caesar, Augustus Caesar, instructing 3 surveyors to describe the world and report back to the Senate. The narrative, that is, propagated in the cosmography that routinely accompanied the itinerary. And it's been suggested that some of the toponyms on the map ultimately derived from the Antonine Itinerary. Examination of the content of the map suggests, however, only a handful of toponyms in North Africa and the Near East that plausibly originate from the itinerary. And even, as I'm trying to show on this table, even those that do seem to perhaps derive from the itinerary come through an intermediary, which is a 12th century Mappamundi, which is thought to be the basis for the Hereford map. It was adapted somewhat, but ultimately quite a lot of its content came through into the Hereford map. So what you're seeing in this central column is a textual record that does survive of this 12th century map, where you can see that, in fact, most of the names are closer to the Antonine Itinerary, and then perhaps come through from that onto the Hereford map. So at present state of research, I think it's safe to say that in England, detailed scholarly engagement with the itinerary seems to have begun only in the 16th century. What, at that time, attracted English antiquaries to the Antonine Itinerary? Above all, of course, it was the 15 British itineraries that concluded the land itineraries. Now these British itineraries at first glance appear unsystematic and uneven, arguably characteristics of the Antonine Itinerary as a whole. Closer inspection shows a logic of description based around certain nodal points. The first two itineraries begin at the northern frontier, the first passing through York to a station called Praetorium, which has never been conclusively identified, but is thought to be somewhere near Bridlington on the northeast coast. The second itinerary is the longest of the sequence, a meandering trawl through Carlisle, York, then west to Chester, Wroxeter, and heading then towards London, through London, onto Canterbury with a terminus at Richborough. The next four itineraries all commence at London. The first two short hops to Dover and Lympne, fifth on the coast, the fifth a seemingly eccentric journey to Carlisle via Colchester, the sixth a more straightforward passage to Lincoln, that's the one we've already looked at. The following three itineraries terminate in London, one approaching from the south, probably starting at Chichester, another from York, a third from Venta Icenorum, which is identified as modern Caister in Norfolk, just now part of Norwich. The 10th, 11th, and 12th itineraries move to the northwest, adding depth and detail to the area previously traversed by the second ITER. Final three itineraries, sorry, I should have moved that on. Final three itineraries all either conclude or commence in Caleva, modern-day Silchester. The first two detail different routes from Isca, Carlion upon Usk, just over the Welsh, what's now the Welsh border, to Silchester, while the final itinerary runs from Silchester to another Isca, Isca Dumnoniorum, which is modern Exeter. In all, 141 stages are recorded by the British itineraries across significant portions of the island, albeit with some notable lacunae. So yes, that's an antiquarian map showing the itineraries. And as you can see, they cover quite a lot of territory, but also have significant gaps in them. Three main phases can be identified in the post-medieval study of the Iter Britannorum. The first 16th century phase culminates in the inclusion of its stations in Camden's Britannia. The second phase, perhaps better moment, came in the book-length treatment accorded to the itinerary in 1658 by William Burton, part of a London antiquarian network associated with the Archbishop of Armagh, James Ussher. The third phase comprises the edition of the Iter Britanniarum by Thomas Gale, published by his son Roger in 1709. William Stukely's comments on the itinerary in his Itinerarium Curiosum of 1724, and the essay by John Horsley, published in his Monumental Britannia Romana of 1732. So I'm going to deal with each of these phases in turn. The first task faced by those who began to study the itinerary in depth in the 16th century was to work out where the more obscure toponyms on the itinerary had been. But the antiquaries were from the beginning also interested in using the itinerary's place names to reveal a history of the land and its peoples. The earliest datable scholarly use of the itinerary appears to have been by John Leland in the notes to his poem Genethliacon Eduardi of 1543, and in his 1545 commentary on another poem, Cygnia Cantio, so Swan Song. It's a poem which includes a kind of journey up the Thames, since there's quite a strong spatial element. And in these notes that he made on his own poem, Leland was particularly interested in what the itinerary might reveal about ancient British tribes. The name Isurium on the first and second itineraries provided a record of the Brigantes, for example. So he says at one point, Antoninus also celebrates Isurium of the Brigantes in his itinerary. It fell at the time Danish forces devastated almost all England with sword and flame. Now it is corn and a rustic estate where once Isurium was. Debris of walls and Roman coins are here very often uncovered by ploughs. The name of the place is now Aldeburg, which means an old town. The itinerary attested to a history that had been violently erased. It also witnessed mutations of fortune, the process by which significant cities became, on the model of Troy, now corn, and a rustic villa. The underlying quotation from Ovid's Heroides, now it's corn where once there was Troy, and that itself is an echo of Virgil's Aeneid, fields where once there was Troy. This these references to now corn or now fields where Troy was became a commonplace of antiquarian discourse, its tone resting somewhere between melancholy and schadenfreude. At the same time, such comments witness early and rather fleeting attempts to connect literary sources to evidence on the ground. Leland had travelled more within Britain than almost all of his peers, and in, for example, identifying the town of Venonium, the Roman town Venonium, with modern Binchester, he noticed a stone road, earthen water pipes, mosaic floors, and Roman coins frequently found in the area. At an unknown date before his death in 1558, Leland's friend Robert Talbot compiled a commentary on the first 5 of the British itineraries. Talbot's commentary was not printed until the 18th century, but manuscript copies, such as this one, now in Corpus Christi College Library, Cambridge, were known to later British antiquaries who cited him in their work. Talbot commented on each toponym he came across, often extensively. Following the itineraries meant traversing much of the island from the vantage point of the library. Talbot used as his sources Pliny's Natural History, Livy, Juvenal, Tacitus, Ausonius, Orosius, Bede's Ecclesiastical History, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, medieval charters, and the Scottish historian Hector Boethius, but above all, and as a first port of call, Ptolemy's Geography. This is particularly evident when he comes across a toponym that he cannot identify, as in the case of the second Iter's Voreda, now identified as Old Penrith. So he says here, and you can perhaps see where his comment in the manuscript, he says Voreda, and he gives the mileage. He's taking this from the printed edition, the 1512 printed edition. He says, I don't find this, unless it's what Ptolemy calls Aurea or Horea. The site agrees well enough. I think Ptolemy says Horea because there the Annona for the army was guarded. And then he gives the plural and refers to Livy. What in the end was the itinerary? Talbot's views on this point seem to develop as he writes. From an early assumption that the roads documented were military ways, he begins to wonder about the nature of the routes outlined. Some were straightforward enough, but others, such as the notorious 5th itinerary, appeared tortuous in the extreme. Who today would travel from London to Carlisle via Chelmsford, he reasonably enough asked. Talbot suggested such a route might reflect administrative or financial purposes, the collection of taxes, for example, or the tour of a proconsul or magistrate through the more important cities. Without resolving the question, he at least posed a problem that continues to attract debate. Did the itinerary represent actual or possible journeys? Were they rooted in administrative experience? If so, of what kind? Or were they highly abstracted, almost theoretical records of place and distance? If the commentaries of Leland and Talbert witness the presence of the itinerary as an increasingly well-known element of the emerging edifice of Roman Britain, its incorporation into William Harrison's description of England and William Camden's Britannia mark its position at the edifice's foundation. Harrison included all 15 of the British itineraries at the very end of his description, which formed Book 1 of Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles. The appearance of Camden's Britannia a decade later confirmed the itinerary's status as a source to be ranked alongside Ptolemy and other ancient authors. Camden's address to the reader in the first 1586 edition of Britannia drew attention to his project of illuminating antiquity while tracing its connection to modernity. The purpose of the work, he said, was the investigation of the most ancient origin of the Britons and English, and bringing forth from darkness the ancient cities of Britain, which Ptolemy, Antoninus, and others recorded. Camden incorporated the data, the itinerary's British section into the Britannia's descriptions of counties. Among many examples, Camden's comment on Sorbiodunum, ancient Salisbury, is perhaps the neatest expression of the way in which the itinerary could underpin the transition from province to kingdoms to nation. Once Sorbiodunum, he says, now its offspring Sarisbury stands in the way, so it is called in the Antonine Itinerary, which Anglo-Saxons afterwards called Sarisbury, and the common Latin Sarum and Sarisburia. The computation of itineraries, the vestige of the name, may bear witness to this even without my arguments, for who questions that Sarisbury issued from Sorbiodunum, with the Saxon bury, meaning a fortified town, added for dunum, which the British and Welsh added to places which occupied a more elevated site, in the manner of this Sorbiodunum. So the Latin name Camden recognizes had incorporated the ancient British language to be adapted and overlaid by the Saxon, from which the modern name had emerged. The toponym held history, its position confirmed by the distances given in the itinerary. In turn, this vestige conferred meaning on its offspring. Through its ancient form, Salisbury became something more than itself. William Burton's monographic treatment of the British section of the Antonine Itinerary, the only such treatment to appear in the 17th century and the first in English, is notable not for any innovation with regard to the identification of toponyms, but rather for its assertion of the importance of the itinerary as a civic document. Burton himself is an ephemeral figure, an Oxford-educated Surrey schoolmaster who retired to London in his mid-40s following an attack of the palsy. He died in 1657, shortly before the appearance of his commentary on Antoninus, his itinerary. Burton claims to have compiled the commentary at the suggestion of James Ussher, Archbishop of Armagh, the renowned biblical scholar, chronologist, and ecclesiastical historian. Burton followed Camden in nearly all his identification of place names, quibbling only when supported by Ussher's commentary on Nennius. More significant is the way in which Burton framed the itinerary. As he boldly asserted in the lengthy subtitle to his work, it was in the itinerary that the first foundation of our cities, laws, and government, according to the Roman policy, are clearly discovered, whence all succeeding ages have drawn their original. This conception of the itinerary is consistent with Burton's desire to inscribe it within a pedagogical program. His imagined audience was the schoolroom. In fact, though, Burton's meandering comments on the British itinerary's toponymies reveal something more fragmentary than the foundation of cities, laws, and government. Various topics are encountered by the by. Grammar, the use of the archaic ablative forms, for example. Ancient religion, mother goddesses, the cult of Isis. Coins, funerary practices, the perception of ocean, British dogs, and the remarkable demise of Burton's great-grandfather, who upon learning of the death of Queen Mary, expired for extremity of joy which he conceived. Throughout the work, it's not clear why he includes that in his discussion of the itineraries, except perhaps to attest to his family's sort of Protestant credentials. Throughout the work, two contradictory impulses emerge. One towards asserting continuities. The Saxons took over the Roman towns, which themselves frequently had British names. So he says at one point, take notice that almost all our great cities and towns in Britain and elsewhere had their beginnings from the Roman castra. The other impulse is to record rupture and ruination. So he says, echoing Leland, on the very ground where Isurium sometimes stood, you may at this time see either cornfields or pasture, et campos ubi Troia fuit, the familiar Virgilian refrain. Such impulses broadly align with the conception of British antiquity advanced by Usher and other members of his circle. At first glance, that conception looks to be a continuation of Camden's periodization, onto which is grafted a history of Christianity in Britain, itself a revision of the Reformation antiquarianism of Archbishop Matthew Parker. Nevertheless, some aspects of Burton's treatment of the itinerary could be probed further. He says very little, in fact, about Roman Christianity, but a significant amount about pre- and non-Christian Roman beliefs. Is the point to establish continuities between Roman pagan religious practice and the subsequent Christian church, or to emphasize the differences? Secondly, the role of the native British seems ambiguous in Burton's account. They serve as a foil to the colonizing road and city-building Romans, against whom they launch periodic rebellions. They are also the ancestors of the Welsh and the Bretons, a marginal but far from invisible presence, traces of whose yet living languages remain in the ancient record. Quite where all this fits in the context of the Commonwealth and Usher's attempts to establish the history of the church in Britain is unclear, but perhaps the emphasis on the continuities of law and government and on the recognition of the remains of the past constitute an underlying point that was political as well as intellectual. The first 3 decades of the 18th century saw not only renewed efforts to establish a scholarly edition of the Iter Britanniarum, but also an intensification of the study of the physical remains of Roman Britain. John Horsley's treatment of the British itineraries in his Britannia Romana of 1732 offers a convenient summation of these trends, since while looking back to Camden, he enters into dialogue with the Gales' recent edition, so this was Thomas and Roger Gale's edition of 1709, with his contemporary William Stukeley's Itinerarium Curiosum. Horsley's essay on the Antonine Itinerary appears in the 3rd and final volume of his work and can be viewed as supplementary to the main purpose of Britannia Romana, which was the reproduction of and commentary on inscriptions and artifacts from throughout Roman Britain. Book 3 of the Britannia Romana comprises Horsley's essays on Ptolemy's geography, the itinerary, the Notitia Dignitatum, the anonymous Ravenna cosmography, which is the 9th century, or a work at least in existence by the 9th century, but which incorporates ancient material, including itineraries, and does include descriptions of Britain. And finally, Poytinger's Table. This last was written by John Ward, the Professor of Rhetoric at Gresham College. So ancient geography supplements imperial detritus, a means of locating the remains and potentially the key to uncovering more. And this is a fine map of Roman Britain that Horsley produced at the start of his work, and it shows a kind of composite image, so places and also peoples drawn from Ptolemy's geography, from the Antonine Itinerary, from Notitia, and also from the various inscriptions he analyzed. And the Roman numerals refer, in fact, to the peoples mentioned by Ptolemy, but you also can see various sites, all the sites that are recorded in the Antonine Itinerary that perhaps gives a little bit more clarity, a little bit more detail of the English part of that map. And you can see that he uses symbols to distinguish the different sources. But really the high point in some ways of antiquarian mapping of Roman Britain. Horsley, like several previous commentators, worked through the British itineraries station by station, focusing particularly on those whose location was disputed or uncertain. Two aspects of his analysis appear distinctive. The first is Horsley's emphasis on mileage as the determining factor in identifying locations as opposed to etymological conjecture. In other words, rather than working back from a modern place name to its putative ancient ancestor, one should rely on the mileage from a known station. This practice put considerable pressure on the itinerary's mileages, figures which all antiquaries had acknowledged had been subject to significant levels of scribal corruption. Nevertheless, it was consistent with the governing assumption of Horsley's analysis, which was that the itineraries represented a record of Roman military ways. The second notable aspect of Horsley's commentary on the Iter Britanniarum is his insistence on first-hand engagement with the land. His commitment to reconstructing the passage of Roman roads led him to attempt to follow them across country, in the process eliciting information from local informants, including gardeners and shepherds, as well as fellow antiquaries. The standard posture of Horsley is on horseback, as much as seated in a library. When I rode from Wyton to York in quest of a military way, he wrote, I observed near Barnby on the moor about 8 miles from York, somewhat very like a Roman way. The military way from hence to Caergwent is mostly very grand and conspicuous. I rode along it with a great deal of pleasure when I went to visit the following station. Riding the way allowed Horsley to question as well as confirm identifications made by other authors. Dr. Gale says that Roman coins are often found here, but I could not hear of any such thing when I was on the spot, nor did I see any Roman inscriptions or sculptures at Bangor. Horsley's activity was not novel. Leland, Talbert, and above all Camden had all made use of first-hand observation and local informants, even as they placed great weight on literary evidence. But by the 18th century, the abundance of Roman material remains in the form of coins, inscriptions, monuments, and other artifacts, allied with the relative ease of travel, inspired a methodology in which the land itself became the primary source, scrutinized by the antiquary on the move. Horsley quotes Stukely with approval. I continued, this is Stukely talking, I continued the Roman road for 2 or 3 miles where it is rarely visited. It is very beautiful, smooth on both sides, broad at top, the holes remaining whence it was taken, with a ditch on each hand. The Antonine Itinerary testified to the ancient road rather than the reverse, and its yet visible path, either incorporated within modern roads or in the form of a vestigial ridge, had become a source of aesthetic pleasure. Before it comes to Beckhampton, Horsley observed, the ridge was very plain and beautiful. So, to conclude, how can we explain the survival but relative neglect of the Antonine Itinerary in the Middle Ages in comparison with the increasingly intense study it attracted from the 16th to the 18th centuries? The answer to this question does not lie in any failure of historical sense or lack of interest in antiquity on the part of medieval scholars. We know of the profound interest of medieval Europe in the geography of the Roman Empire, attested by the Hereford map and many other artifacts. Instead, three interrelated factors may help to explain the emergence of the itinerary as a canonical text of ancient geography. First, the rise in interest in the itinerary is intimately connected with the development of humanist approaches to literary study in the 15th and 16th centuries. Such approaches not only sought to identify the correct form of lexical elements, for example, through the comparison of manuscript copies, they also subjected texts such as the Antonine Itinerary to rigorous comparison with roughly contemporaneous source material. Comparison of this kind was not unheard of during the Middle Ages, but it was practiced in a less systematic and wide-ranging manner. In this regard, it could be argued that the Antonine Itinerary only really became legible with the translation of Ptolemy's geography into Latin in the first decade of the 15th century. As the remarks of 16th century antiquaries show, it was Ptolemy that acted as a frame of reference for the establishment of Roman Britain. To Ptolemy, other sources, such as the Notitia Dignitatum, the Ravenna Cosmography, the Peutinger Table, were added to form a corpus of ancient geography. As we have seen, by the opening decades of the 18th century, the appeal of empirical observation of the land had become irresistible, with the result that literary evidence was increasingly demoted beneath the evidence of coins, inscriptions, ruins, and other material vestigia found in situ. But the initial impetus towards the study of the itinerary drew much from the newfound legibility of the text when placed alongside Ptolemy's representation of the empire. There is one final context to note in attempting to explain the emergence of the Antonine Itinerary as a significant antiquarian text, that of patriotism. Across Europe, during the 16th and 17th centuries, the itinerary was scrutinized for what it could reveal about the ancient history of particular regions and their peoples, whether in Gaul, the Rhineland, the Alps, ancient Bavaria, or Britain. Equal attention was not given to North Africa, Egypt, or Asia Minor. No British antiquary of this period attempted a commentary on any section of the itinerary other than the British section, the Iter Britanniarum. A pan-imperial document had been compartmentalized along provincial but also proto-nationalistic lines. Naturally, those lines did not always conform to early modern national borders. The Antonine Itinerary held one of the keys to Roman Britain, but by the middle of the 18th century, its limitations for British antiquaries were plain. Not only was it reticent on British peoples, it was restricted in spatial terms. It did not extend into Scotland or Wales, now parts of Great Britain. In the southwest, it ceased at Exeter. The Iter Britanniarum was in the end really an Iter Anglorum. Inevitably, too, the work of the great antiquaries such as Camden, Stukely, and Horsley, allied with editors such as Gale, had robbed the itinerary of much of its mystery. Each station had been studied, and even those that remained uncertain had accrued a history of debate beneath their names. The professionalization of historical studies, the development of principles of scholarly editing, and their correlation with archaeological research all lay in the future. But the high point of the Antonine Itinerary's English reception had by now been reached. Its capacity to generate intense study, to prompt scholars to traverse far-flung counties in search of its traces, and to inspire proclamations of its fundamental nature would never again be so great. Thank you.
Any questions?
That's absolutely fascinating and gives one a great deal to think about. I think one of the things, of course, is that what you were talking about actually has coloured the way that Roman Britain has been studied at least till the last century probably to the middle of the last century. I think one of the things is that although we get early on the mention of people following the routes and perhaps finding coins, what they don't get is if you go to southern Gaul, or particularly to Italy, were sculptures and inscriptions in great numbers. Even when you look at Horsley and compare the illustrations, they're absolutely dreadful compared with the illustrations that were being produced of antiquities in Italy, for example. One of the things that I'm sure is terribly important and fits in with the Elizabethan period anyway, coming and with the period following, is that Britain has become an imperial power. It's the new Rome, and so the great interest in, if you just concentrate on Britain and say this was the Roman Empire, forget the rest. This is Britain with all these roads and all these places still exist, and they're great centres of power and things like that. So I think that that it tells you quite a lot about attitudes, not just to Rome, but to history in general in the early modern period. I thought it was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, firstly, yeah, I think certainly the English antiquaries like Horsley, and thank you for drawing attention to that. I mean, that his main purpose of his work really is to comment on the inscriptions and to, you know, to reproduce them and trying to sort of make some sense of the physical remains of the Roman Empire in Britain. But it is certainly very influenced in doing that by continental models. And yes, perhaps there is also a sense of the, perhaps that's one reason why these English antiquaries put so much importance on something like the Antonine Itinerary, because it really gives them something quite tangible to map and to show and to assert the importance of Britain within the Roman Empire. But in terms of your point about empire, I think that's something I've certainly been thinking about, and sometimes it's not, I mean, sometimes it's implicit really, I suppose, rather than explicit in the sorts of things these antiquaries say. I think it's coming to the fore in someone like Burton, actually, in the kinds of claims he's making about the importance of Roman cities, you know, for as a sort of origin point, I suppose, for English English cities. It also comes out a lot more then after the Restoration, with Ogilby's work on and his maps of roads, which he dedicates to Charles II, and makes a great deal actually about, in his preface to that work in 1675, about the importance of itineraries in ancient history and but also kind of in the present day. So I think gradually the, if you like, the imperial theme does become more apparent. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that talk. I very much hope that has been published or is to be published. In the 1540s, there started to be published tables of highways for the first time, which list the 7 or 8 roads from London, which follow the modern road and are very different, obviously completely different really from those on the Antonine Itinerary. But I just wondered whether the idea for them might have come from increasing interest in those itineraries. I mean, they're normally associated with Thomas Cromwell's work on the post roads, but it could be an interesting connection. If I may, if I could have a frivolous second question, are the itineraries as extraordinarily eccentric for the rest of the empire as they are for Britain?
Thank you for the first point. I mean, I don't know if there is a connection between those highways from the 1540s. I mean, it is obviously, as you know, the period of that is contemporaneous with Leland and also with Talbot, so it's conceivable, but not necessarily the case. With the in terms of the eccentricity, yes, basically, and this is why people have often been puzzled. I'm just going to go back to the list that I had it right at the beginning of the different. Sorry, there's a lot to get through. There they are. This is why people have been puzzled about what the itinerary, the itinerary really is, because it ranges from sometimes very short itineraries of even a single stage or 3 or 4 stages to these vast, and some are very direct, and others, kind of meandering and going all over the place. So I think that's, why people have there've been various different conjectures about and attempts to explain that. I mean, one attempt to explain it is that it's actually a transcription of a map, of an itinerary map like the Poitinger table. But then there are people who argue against that. So, yeah. But yes, in short, the answer to your question is, it is reasonably representative. What is unusual about the British itineraries, of course, is that they are contained within a single province, or a single part of empire. The others, tend to move, from Gaul into Spain, from Italy to other parts of the empire.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. This is a question an ignorant question from a medievalist. These lists of itineraries sort of make someone like myself think of those itineraries by Matthew Paris, which are drawn, but they go from sort of town to town, and they have, and they're going to Rome or whatever, and they have a little image of the town, and you can see the sea. And I suppose, to that extent, are related to the Poitinger map. I don't know, but these made me really think about that, and I just wondered whether there was more knowledge of this in, say, medieval England. I mean, you said that there were quite a few Carolingian copies of this, anyway, I just wondered, and in fact, you also said that there were some copies of it within 11th, 12th, 13th century England as well. So that's my question. I suppose it's contextualizing the Matthew Paris material.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, it's a very good question. And I mean, I started really this research by trying to look for examples of medieval usage and copying of the Antonine Itinerary, because really it's a text that's mainly been of interest to classicists, people trying to, interested in the ancient world and places in the ancient world. So I was interested in that, and but I have to say I haven't found a lot of evidence of people actually using it. And one index of that, sorry to keep flicking around these different slides, but one index of that is the sort of most of the manuscript copies, although there are quite a few of them, are really kind of clean in that sense that they're not, like this. I mean, okay, this is a 15th century copy and it maybe was meant for display, but you don't find people, writing anything, glossing them on the side, like they're not actually investigating the toponyms and trying to, what you might hope to find is that they're trying to identify, a contemporary place, and you really don't find much evidence of that in the manuscripts themselves. But in terms of your point about Matthew Paris, yeah, thank you. And I mean, that was actually one thing that started me in this research and wondering whether Matthew himself, where did he get the idea for this kind of pictorial itinerary from? Because it's actually not that common. Itineraries are very common, and obviously pilgrimage itineraries are common in the Middle Ages, but not so much this kind of pictorial itinerary. And it's not, beyond the realms of possibility that, something like, I mean, clearly the Poitinger table is being copied around in the start of the 13th century. Probably, I mean, this copy almost certainly comes from somewhere in southern Germany or the Swiss area, but it's not sort of absolutely out of the question. But so yeah, Matthew definitely does do that, produce a sort of pictorial itinerary, which I think in some ways echoes, however kind of directly, he whatever kind of source material he had, echoes kind of a classical tradition. And then, yeah, it's, yes, exactly. He doesn't, he does it in, day, this is one day from here to there. So it's much more, perhaps, directly linked, perhaps in that sense, to an idea of travel, less abstracted, in other words, than the Antonine Itinerary. But nevertheless, I think you can certainly say that there's a tradition of itineraries, both written itineraries, to a lesser extent pictorial itineraries, which comes from classical antiquity, late antiquity, through into the Middle Ages, and is carried on, definitely.
I have a question from the digital floor, from Margaret Cormack, who's interested to know about the reception of the Antonine Itinerary amongst antiquarians in other European countries. And we talked about a kind of nascent English or British imperialism. How did it get worked up in the 16th and 17th centuries in France, Germany, and so on? To become German. I
think a really clear trend in the 16th century is towards the kind of compartmentalization, the same thing that happens in Britain, where they're just really interested in the British itineraries, is visible in other places. So you have, there's an interest, one of the early antiquaries who's interested is Beatus Rhenanus, and he's interested in it because he's interested in as it were, the left bank of the Rhine. So he's interested in Germania, but the part of Germania that is kind of, as it were, on the wrong side of the Rhine, but which is part of the Roman part, and which is partially covered by the Antonine Itinerary. So he finds some material there. Early sort of antiquaries are interested in Bavaria, are interested in doing this thing where the same thing that someone like Talbert is doing, which is taking the toponyms on the itinerary and trying to match them to modern places, or if they can't find a modern place, work out where they were. And also the Swiss antiquaries get very interested in them. So the 1575 edition is by Josiah Simler. He is a Swiss antiquary. He's interested in the Alpine routes. So yeah, there's definitely that kind of interest in the 16th century, and then particularly in the 17th century, I think you get the itineraries that deal with Gaul are of course particularly of interest to French antiquaries. So overall, in general, yes, there's a tendency to compartmentalize in a sort of patriotic way, proto-nationalistic way, you could say. And I'll just finish by saying the very important edition which comes out in the first half of the 18th century by Peter Wesseling, who kind of comments in the edition, actually lots of people have talked about this itinerary, but not in a general way. They've talked about parts of it. So the Spanish have talked about the Spanish bits, the English have talked about the British bits, the French have talked about the French, and so forth. So I think that is a real phenomenon. But it's definitely of interest to antiquaries across Europe.
This is in a way a follow-up for the last two questions. The volumes you've illustrated, products of what you might call the high scholarship of the Renaissance period and later. Is it possible to say anything about how knowledge of interest in percolated downwards into the intelligentsia, the authors of county histories as they proliferate and so forth? I mean, were they known to Sir Thomas Browne, for instance?
I don't know. I think so. I think that there is. I think that it goes in this. All I can say probably in response to that is that in the 16th century, it definitely goes from being quite an obscure text, but by virtue of it appearing in print and being reasonably accessible, I think then it does start to become, quite well known, and so that by the end of the 16th century, someone like Camden can really refer to it, and he knows that everybody knows it. So I think it is. I'm forgetting the person who works on Kent, the 16th century antiquary who works on Kent in the. Thank you. Yeah, he for instance refers to it at times. So while it's not it's not always of great use to those kinds of antiquaries. They're aware of it, I think, increasingly.
Thank you very much indeed. I greatly enjoyed it. I have a couple of queries. Could you say a little about the York 14th century copy? Was that at St. Mary's Abbey or the Minster? And secondly, I was thinking the heralds in the 1530s onwards were travelling around the country, if you like, making itineraries, and one can very much see why a man like Camden, who was duty-bound to go on travels, would have been interested, and slightly earlier heralds, Robert Glover, who was a friend of Lambarde's, equally had that motivation. I wonder if you could enlarge a little on that. Lambarde was planning to cover the whole of the country. He only published on Kent in the end. He did try to produce historical maps, the kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons and so on. I wondered if he had plans to make more of the itinerary elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. The York manuscript, it's currently it's ended up in the BNF. It's quite a miscellaneous manuscript. It's copied by a Carmelite, or at least that part of it that contains the bit of the itinerary is copied by a Carmelite. The only bit of the itinerary is the maritime itinerary in that particular manuscript, and it's quite a bad, textually corrupt kind of copy. It looks like it's quite possibly, therefore, compiled from a lot of different historical kind of historiographical material, and it seems to be, and there's been a kind of connection made with York. There's also a suggestion that that particular part of the manuscript might be a copy of an earlier compilation made in the 12th century in Durham by under the sort of auspices of Hugh de Puisay, the bishop there. I can't localize it any further for you than that. As for the other part of your question, the heralds and Lambarde, I don't know. That would be interesting to look at, and I will go back and look at Lambarde more. It's possible. What's interesting at that point is that a lot of these antiquaries, of course, and Talbot is true of Talbot too, is very interested also in recovering Anglo-Saxon history too. So they're interested in. I think one thing you learn is that our periodizations do not apply to them. So they're not so much seeing things in terms of kind of classical and medieval. They're seeing kind of, ancient, and then they do see a kind of, they're obviously, they're probably conceiving it more in terms of, there is a periodization, but it's to do with, Roman, Saxon, Norman, rather than some idea of the medieval. But yeah, definitely good point, and I will look more at that.
Right. If there are no other pressing questions, then I invite you all to join me in thanking Alfred once more for his stimulating lecture.